Hi, everyone. Welcome to Sociology 101. This is Chapter 12, Gender Issues. So just a reminder, I said this for the last chapter, but these are simply the highlights, right? So I'm giving you a little bit of visual, a little bit of video and audio, but definitely not what we would have if we were in class together. But the highlights are the highlights. So let's get started. One of the first questions we have to ask ourselves is, are men and women different, right? I think the answer to that is likely a yes. Having said that, I don't think we're as different as what we have thought we were in the past. And I think we're starting to see some of that today. So to get started with that, let's get a couple of terms out of the way. First of all, sex and gender. Like many terms in sociology, how we use them in sociology is very different than how it's used outside of the classroom. So it is pretty common outside of the classroom for people to use the two terms sex and gender interchangeably. I've filled out applications before that ask my gender, right? So what we need to know is sex is biological, sex is chromosomal, right? So we're talking X and X or X and Y. There are some variations from there, but those are the two most common, right? So when people say sex, they're really talking about male and female. Gender, on the other hand, relates to how masculine and or feminine each of us is, not our sex, right? Masculine and or feminine. So each of us has some traits that are masculine and some traits that we have historically considered feminine. Maybe one of the better examples of this to illustrate how culture really determines for us how we're supposed to act is Margaret Mead. So Margaret Mead in the 1930s was a fairly new anthropologist. And she studied under a gentleman by the name of Frank Boas. Frank Boas was a cultural determinist. And what cultural determinist means as it relates to gender is that culture defines for us our gender. And what that means is culture defines for us how men should act and how women should act. And you see throughout history, there's an arc to this, right? So it varies over time. In the 1950s, for example, the ultimate male, or at least the ultimate male in Hollywood. I just lost his name. Let's go back to Margaret Mead. Then we'll come back to my 1950s story. So Margaret Mead in the 1930s goes to New Guinea, and she studies three tribes, two of which we're going to talk about. The first tribe that she studied were the Arapesh, right? So the Arapesh were a very gentle people. Men and women participated equally in child rearing. There wasn't a lot of yelling. There weren't curse words. These were just a very nice people. Now, look, they may have lived on one of the most inhospitable pieces of land in New Guinea, but they were just a calm, gentle people. So what Margaret Mead was telling us is that the Arapesh, both men and women, were what we would consider to be feminine, or at least their traits and characteristics were feminine. A second group that she studied, the Mundigamor, which today are called the Biwat, highly aggressive, right? Men and women. It was pretty common for men and women to yell at each other, curse at each other, hit each other. The way they treated their children, we would consider to be child abuse. They were a very rough, right? A very rough exterior kind of people. They lived on a piece of land that had an awful lot of resources to it, a lot of water, and the other thing it had was a lot of mosquitoes. And so that was one of the reasons that some people didn't want the piece of land that they were on. Having said that, the Mundigamor, or the Biwat today, were both sexes, both men and women, were masculine, right? They were highly aggressive, or at least traits that we consider to be masculine. And so what Margaret Mead was telling us was that culture determines our masculinity and femininity. So if we go back to the 1950s and we take a look at John Wayne movies, right? John Wayne in the 1950s was essentially the ultimate male, right? John Wayne was about 6'2", which was tall in 1950. He had a clause in his contract that no one else in any movie he was in, he did Westerns, no one else could be his height or taller. If you wanted to be in a John Wayne movie, you better be shorter than 6'2". I just always found that a little bit interesting. In the 60s, John Wayne did a movie called Big Jake. And maybe I've referred to this before in class, but you know what? You get to hear the story again. John Wayne in the movie Big Jake, he was Big Jake. John Wayne was such a man. He was so masculine that his dog in the movie, he was too much of a man. He was too masculine to name his dog, Spot or Fido. He named his dog Dog, right? So, I mean, that's how masculine he was. And just think for a moment, how would he do today, right? I mean, how would he navigate the world that we live in today? I imagine he would struggle, right? Because he would be 70 years removed from his time in the world. And look, he probably didn't act like that in real life, but his character in the movies made an awful lot of money playing that kind of a masculine character. But again, the point being that culture determines gender, right? So are men and women different? Sure we are, right? But having said that, how different we are probably has something to do with culture, not just biology. Okay. Gender socialization. This is actually one that we've talked a little bit about before, but let's retouch on this just so we're all on the same page. As we've talked about before, gender socialization begins at birth, right? As a matter of fact, it probably begins before birth when you're painting the baby's room, what colors you're going to use, you're going to choose what toys, what clothes your infant is going to have. Right, so all of those things are going to influence the gender and how the gender of your child comes out, right? How that emanates from within the child. And again, a lot of that has to do with how we set things up, the games that they play, right? The games that children play have a lot to do with gender and gender socialization. We treat boys and girls differently. It's at a holiday gathering with your family, which we're not going to right now, right? So, but when we are able to return after the coronavirus, when we are able to return to quasi-normal life, you'll have a holiday gathering at one of your family members' homes, and it'll be wonderful and great food. You'll eat too much. It'll be great. Sometime during the festivities, 2 4-year-old boys, or approximately 4-year-old boys, are going to wrestle around a little bit. And it's likely, and this may be one of the older members of your family, but you're likely to hear somebody say, oh, boys will be boys, right? That's just absolutely how boys act. And that's reinforcing a stereotype, right? That's reinforcing boys. They hear that. That's reinforcing them that it's okay. It's even encouraged to wrestle and be physical and be aggressive. If in the same family, 2 4-year-old girls also start to wrestle, and if you hear particularly an older family member say to them, hey, let's stop that. Nice girls don't act like that, right? That's reinforcing, that's culture, right? So that's reinforcing the stereotype of girls are feminine, girls are soft, girls are pretty, they're not aggressive. That's what boys do, right? So how we engender our children has a lot to do with not only how the child is going to turn out, but it has a lot to do with the society that we come from, right? The culture that we live in. And just trying to point out in a sociology class, because again, our job is really to view society and see how it works, right? How do people get along with each other? It's one of the first things we talked about in our class. This is one of the ways we find that out. So the next time you are at a family gathering, just pay attention to how children are treated, what they're encouraged to do, what they're encouraged not to do, and see if those fall within, some stereotypical ways, right? And that'll be a real nice clue for how culture is a part of each of us, right? Each of us grows up with culture, and how that culture has a lot to do with who we become as adults. Okay. Patriarchy, right? So if you're following along in the slides, this one is, what is patriarchy? Patriarchy is male dominated, right? So almost every society on this planet is male dominated, right? So men have been in control of a lot of things. They've been in control of money. They've been in control of work. They've been in control of relationships. So those are patriarchal societies. In these kinds of societies, we typically put more of an emphasis on what men think and a little less emphasis on what women think, right? Because, the wait till your father gets home, right? Because father determines punishments and the rules of the house and what goes and what doesn't go. We still have that, right? We've had a lot of changes over the last 20 years, but we still have quite a bit of that. We watched in class several weeks ago, a commercial from 1979, 1980. It was a commercial about a perfume for women called Woman by Enjoli. Right? So, and in this particular commercial, if you remember, you can look for it on YouTube, I guess, if you want. But if you look for this commercial about Woman by Enjoli, what you're going to find is a woman singing, and she's working, right? So this is 70s, 80s. This was new for women to be working. And so she talks about how she can bring home the bacon, she can fry it up in a pan, right? So women for the last 40 years have been working at least 2 shifts, right? And that means you work all day just like the man does. And then when you come home, and this is the important part, when you come home, you're not off work yet, right? Because you still have to cook and clean and make sure the kids are doing what they're supposed to be doing. So the first 2 lines of that, right? The first 2 taglines are, I can bring home the bacon, fry it up in a pan. And the third one, just to really put a capper on it, is never let him forget he's a man, right? So you're essentially working 2 jobs, right? You work all day, you cook and clean when you get home, and then don't forget your wifely duties later on, right? So that's, like you're not tired. So it's just, this has been in a patriarchal culture. We're evolving, but we're still there, right? We still haven't found a way to remove ourselves from this kind of a culture. We've seen a lot of advancement, right? Over 55% of all college students are female. I believe right now we continue to have more females in medical school than we do males. So we're seeing things. We're seeing more women in Congress than we have in the past, although it doesn't really put us in the top countries in terms of percentage of women in the legislature, but we're improving. So that's what patriarchy is. Women's participation in the labor force, right? So you've probably seen you've probably seen the poster of the woman showing the bicep during World War II, right? So she was Rosie the Riveter. So she was going to work in a factory. Men were off fighting the war. So during World War II in the 40s, she's working. Right? I mean, she's making parts for tanks. She's making parts for guns. She's doing all those sorts of things. We had a shortage of rubber at that particular time because of the war. So it was pretty common for her to be changing a flat tire fairly consistently because there really wasn't rubber to buy new tires. So you're just continuing to patch the old one. So Rosie the Riveter and all these women went to work. Right? And they kept this country going. They helped with the war, all those things. So then the war's over, and the bosses said to Rosie and to everyone else, thanks. but it's time for the guys to come back to work, right? So many women who had a taste of work didn't want that to go away, right? They kind of liked being in charge of their own finances. They liked being more in control of their own lives. And so we started to see at that point, and we had seen it before, it'd been on an arc, but we saw that arc jump a little bit post World War II, even though that's when the baby boom generation started, right? So one of the things we started talking about just a few years later was how much do women earn compared to men, right? So in 1970, as one of your overheads illustrates, in 1970, women made about 62 cents on the dollar, so 62% of what men make. In 2006, 2007, we're at 81, 82%, right? So we've seen an increase in that. The problem that we've had, the big problem that we've had, and just write this down somewhere, is the glass ceiling, right? And so what that refers to, the bottom rungs of an organization, women are kind of equally represented in many jobs, not all jobs, but in many jobs with men. And oftentimes they're making similar pay. It's as people move up the corporate ladder that we see fewer women, and we start to see that real disparity in play. And look, you can say things like, well, women are more likely to stay home and have children. It's true, right? But there are many women who continue to work and continue to work their way up. So when it comes to jobs like chief executive officer, chief operating officer, chief financial officer, your IT person, these are almost always men in these jobs. And so what the glass ceiling is women can see these jobs, and these are the seven-figure jobs, right? These are the $1 million jobs with stock options and all that kind of stuff. So women are just the rung below. They can see it. They just can't get there, right? And when a woman does make it there, she oftentimes doesn't last long. There's a lot of changes. She gets blamed really quickly. So these are the kinds of things that we continue to see, right? So for us as a society, to continue to move away from patriarchal, and I don't know how far we've come yet, but for us to get there, we have to have more opportunities for women. We have to give women as many options at the top of the food chain, as it were, as we do for men. And we have a ways to go with that, right? So when we're talking about women's earnings compared with men, these are some of the issues that we're talking about. Okay. We talked about the second shift. Oh, all right. Well, let me preface this way. You cannot make a sociologist happy, right? I mean, if there's something that we complain about and it changes, trust me, we're going to complain about it, right? I mean, that's just the way that it goes. So for the longest time, we in sociology were advocating for, in K through 12, we were advocating for uniforms, right? And part of the reason we were advocating for uniforms was we did not want there to be discrimination based on income, right? And so we didn't want it to be obvious that one person had significantly fewer resources than someone else, right? And that can definitely be shown through clothing. And so we wanted to see uniforms, right? So when people went to school, you couldn't tell who was rich and who was poor. Well, here's the part where you just can't please us. Now what we want to see, right? So now we have a next level grievance. So we're seeing more and more schools that are doing dress codes, right? A lot of private schools do dress codes. Our complaint is what we really don't want to see, because this just reinforces gender stereotypes, is we don't want to see women wear dresses, men wear jackets, right? I mean, let's just move that part away. What I see in some schools in the city when I go by is I see everyone wearing khakis and a white button down, right? And that's kind of like that, right? It's more difficult to differentiate between boys and girls, between men and women. You can't really tell who's rich and who's poor. So there's a lot of positives to that. So there is some progress, but again, you can't keep us happy. We're always we're always looking for something wrong. So that's just that's kind of who we are. If we're going to talk about violence against women, we have to talk about things like sexual harassment. So one of the things I want everyone to know is I want you to know what quid pro quo is, right? Quid pro quo. So quid pro quo is real simple. This for that. And so an older male boss will say to a younger female, he will say to her, hey, if you have sex with me, then I'll promote you, I'll give you a raise. That's the most common type of sexual harassment in the workplace. You do this for me, I'll do that for you, right? And people have gotten pretty sneaky about how they do those things, right? I mean, they're not going to send you an email with that. So, right? So people try as hard as they can to kind of keep that down so that people aren't as aware of it. It's interesting to me in the 80s, one of the first movies that I saw, actually the first I can remember, that was about sexual harassment was, of course, Michael Douglas was in the movie. I don't recall the name of the movie, but Michael Douglas, a man, was sexually harassed by his female boss. And I'm not saying that doesn't happen. It just made me laugh. It's like, really, Hollywood, the first movie you're going to do on sexual harassment is going to be a man being harassed by a woman. So anyway, thank you, Hollywood, for helping us all along with this particular issue. But the other thing that we know about violence toward women, and the other thing that we know about sexual harassment and rape and those sorts of issues, is the more open this is in public, the more difficult it is for women. So the more okay it is for men to make catcalls and, make rude comments to women in public, the more public that is, typically the less good life is for women, right? The more okay it is in those kinds of situations for harassment to occur. We may have talked about this before. Every summer, I don't know about this summer, but every summer in Chicago, we have what's called the Slut Walk, right? So it started in New York several years ago. A woman in New York had been raped. It was pretty clear she'd been raped. The accuser went to trial. It was really clear that he was the person that raped her. And the judge, who retired just days after this verdict, it was a bench trial, which meant the judge made the decision. And the judge decided, and he stated this, the judge decided that the man was not guilty based on how the woman was dressed. And he actually said that she was asking to get raped based on how she was dressed. So the Slut Walk originated in New York, and now it's in all the major cities. And women walk around it's a parade, essentially, right? In the gaudiest lingerie wear. I think you have to go to Goodwill to find it, right? But they walk around in the gaudiest stuff you can find with signs that are just simply saying, look, here I am, I'm walking around in lingerie. I'm not being raped right now, right? So just bringing attention to how ridiculous it is to think about this power act, this violent act, having anything to do with how women are dressed. And so if you get a chance to check out the Slut Walk in Chicago this summer, again, I don't know how many parades we're going to have in the city of Chicago this summer with the coronavirus. But if we do, and maybe you have to wait till 2021, but you can absolutely check it out. So I like it because I think it's a pretty clever way to get back at sexual harassment and bring awareness to that. Okay, political inequality. When I was in grad school, we had 4 or 5 sociologists from then the Soviet Union, from the former Soviet Union, come to where I was going to grad school, Ball State University. And we were just chatting. Fortunately, they spoke English because I don't know any Russian. So as we were talking, we both sets of people grew up. I grew up during the Cold War, not realizing it was the Cold War at the time, but I grew up thinking, oh, that the Soviet Union is backwards and what's wrong with these people. Well, these men grew up from the Soviet Union, grew up thinking the same thing about me, which was really enlightening to me, right, to actually hear that. And so as we're talking, and we're trying to one-up each other to a certain extent, right? We're academics. You kind of do that every once in a while. And one of them said to me, he said, he said, in my country, he said, in the Soviet Union, women gained suffrage, women gained the right to vote before women in the United States did. And I said, there's no way that's true, right? There's no way that's true. So the two of us immediately looked it up. And I'll be darned, he was right. Women in the Soviet Union did gain the right to vote before women in the United States. And I still remember my grandmother, she was born in 1904, and I remember her talking about that when the right for women to vote came up, it was a big deal for her, right? Because she was just coming of age when that was happening. She couldn't wait until she was going to be able to vote. It was just such a big deal to her. And so that's one of the times I really had my eyes open to, maybe I need to question some of these assumptions that I have about my country or about what I think about things. Maybe I need to challenge some of those assumptions. This was definitely one of those times. So when it comes to political inequality, we've had inequality, obviously, for quite some time. The United States has yet to have a female as president. I thought we were going to 3 years ago. We definitely didn't. So there's no longer a female running for 2020. So it seems as if, and this is less true than it used to be, but it's still pretty true. It seems as if political parties, and let's face it, political parties have the money, right? Political parties almost always choose who the candidate's going to be coming out of the Democrats or out of the Republicans because they put their money behind that particular candidate. And it seems as if both parties put their money behind men, right? Oftentimes when the Democratic or the Republican Party put their money behind a female, oftentimes it's when she really doesn't have it. They don't have a chance of winning that election. So it's, let's throw a woman out there. I mean, look, when John McCain was running against President Obama in 2008, we're coming out of a deep recession, right? I mean, we were hemorrhaging millions of jobs, and you knew President Bush was leaving office, and you knew just simply based on the economy, you knew we were going to have a Democratic president, right? I mean, the country, when the economy's that bad, we almost always, not almost always, we always go with the other party, right? That's just the way that it works. So John McCain, right, who just passed away a couple years ago, John McCain, the Maverick, was running against President Obama, well, then candidate Obama. And John McCain knew he didn't have a chance, right? He wasn't a stupid man. So when Obama passed Hillary and gained, and he was going to be the one actually to go for president, John McCain chose female governor from Alaska, right? And people were, who is this person? Is there any way, right? I mean, just think about it. Is there any way that's who he chooses to be his vice presidential running mate if he thinks he has a chance of winning that election? We both know the answer, right? The answer is absolutely not. If he thought he had a chance to win that election, he never picks up the phone and calls Sarah Palin, right? That phone call doesn't happen. If he thought he had a chance to win, maybe you could give him credit for thinking, well, maybe the people who wanted Hillary will vote for me because I have a female running mate. You have to be a pretzel to make some certain logic. But anyway, political inequality, we still have it today. All right. Okay, let's talk about a couple things. Feminist, right? It's interesting. Feminism started in Seneca Falls, New York, 140 years ago, right? And it's interesting. What feminists were asking for were three basic things, right? Feminists wanted women to be considered equals to men, right? Not subjugated to men, but equals to men. They wanted equal opportunity, right? They wanted equal opportunity in the workforce. They wanted equal opportunity in education. And last but not least, they wanted equal pay for the same work. And based on those three things, feminists in this country were immediately labeled as anti-family, right? Have you figured out why yet? So the thought at the time was that for every woman working, that meant a family didn't have a place to live and didn't have food to eat, right? So just stay with me here. The idea was that our employment system is a closed system, right? Meaning that there's X number of jobs, period. It doesn't fluctuate. There's just X number of jobs. To make it easy, say that's 100. And if there are 100 jobs and a woman is working, then that means that a man is not working. And if a man is not working, well, he would, of course, be the breadwinner. He would be paying the mortgage. He would be putting food on the table. He would be feeding his family. So for every woman working, then that means a family that's going without food, right? So that's how far this argument was taken. So the complaints against feminists stuck, right? The prejudice against feminists started right away. And so even today, when people say feminist, you're going to have some people who applaud that, right? Who advocate for that. You're going to have many people who are going to cringe a little bit, right? Who are, wait a second, I don't like that term, right? So that's kind of what we see. Feminists have gotten a bad rap over the years. Again, if people would just go back to what feminists were asking for, right, to be considered equal to men, I think we've made a lot of the way there. It's probably relationships where we don't see as much of that because we see men in relationships expecting the female today to still do more cooking and cleaning than they do. Then I always have a student in my class who says, oh, my boyfriend's the best and he does all the cooking and all the cleaning. Good for you, right? Good for you. That's awesome. Let's just look at all the numbers, right? Because that's a rarer breed than what you may think it is. So anyway, a couple things I want you to be able to differentiate between, as we're talking about feminist approaches, are liberal feminists and radical feminists, right? So a liberal feminist would describe it, the differences between men and women, gender differences, in terms of social and cultural attitudes, right? They'll talk about sexism, they'll talk about discrimination, a lot of the things that we've talked about already during this particular video. So those are liberal feminists. Radical feminists argue that men are responsible for the exploitation of women through patriarchy, right? So that's taking that argument, injecting some steroids in it, and just ramping it up a little bit, right? So we're going to focus on exploitation within radical feminist approach, and we're really going to lay that at the feet of men and patriarchy, right? So they're both kind of coming from the same place, but they just take it a little bit stronger. So last thing, postmodern feminists, right? So at the end of chapter 11, we talked about race and we added gender to it, right? So for this conversation, we're taking gender and we're adding race to it. So what postmodern feminists do and what black feminists do is they challenge the idea that all women share an identity and an experience. They're all women, right? But again, as a reminder from chapter 11, not all women are sharing the same experiences. And so people coming from middle class and upper middle class and upper class homes are just living a different life than everyone else. many minority women, particularly African American women, are working multiple jobs, are running single households, right? They're rearing children on their own with oftentimes not a lot of support, if any support. And so the idea being that that is a completely different experience than what another mom might have in a white household that has a lot more money and resources, access to tutors and nannies and just all those kinds of things, right? So when we see these kinds of different approaches to feminism, we see just a different piece of the picture. So I want you to be able to differentiate between these. So thank you for coming to class today. I greatly appreciate it. I hope your semester is going well. And I'm not going to see you this semester in person, but I hope things go well for you. Thank you.